Hi friends! Today we are going to be painting watercolor monsters. Monsters are fun to paint because they can be silly, scary, strange, and anything in between. There's no right or wrong way to paint a monster, so that makes them easy to create. You can do this project alone, but it's a lot more fun if you have friends or family who can draw and paint with you. Before we start drawing our monsters today, we need to think about traits that monsters have. Maybe you're envisioning a monster with 3 eyes. Maybe it's slimy, ginormous, or has feathers and horns. If you are working alone, you can think of 3 to 5 traits that a monster would have and draw your monster using those ideas. If you're working with others, everyone should take a moment to silently think of one characteristic that a monster would have, and then make a list using suggestions from everyone in the group. If you are working in a group of 10 or more, you should probably break into smaller sections and create lists of 5 to 10 traits. Here is the list that we created in class today. You can use this list if you want to, or you can make one of your own. By looking at this list, I can see that my monster should have wings and feathers, it's slimy, it needs to have a tail, at least 1 horn, and some eyes. Now, I'll spend a moment thinking about what my monster will look like using these guidelines. You can sketch it out on scrap paper if you'd like to practice, that's optional. Then when you are ready, draw your monster on watercolor paper, very lightly, using a pencil. After you've drawn your monster in pencil, you can trace over those lines with a Sharpie. Sharpie is waterproof, so you can paint right over any marker lines with watercolor paint. You could also use a crayon for this if you don't have a Sharpie. You can pause the video here if you are making this project along with me today, and come back when your monster is drawn. Don't do any pencil shading on your monster. We are going to color it with paint today. We are going to use wet into wet technique to make our monsters very colorful. For this project, you will need your monster that was drawn on watercolor paper, a large flat paintbrush, and an assortment of smaller brushes, a cup of water, paper towels, and a watercolor set. I will be working with a Prang 18-pan watercolor set today. I like this brand because they're affordable for students to purchase, the colors are very vibrant, and the paints last for quite a long time. No matter what type of paints you plan to use, you'll need to get the watercolor cakes ready by dripping drips of water into each color. I use my big brush for this, and I hold my brush about 1 inch above the tray to avoid touching colors. This will keep my water clean. If there's a color that I know I'm not going to use today, I don't need to drip drips into that color. At this point, my paints should have a few drips of water soaking into each pan, and my water should still be clear. Now I'm going to quickly paint clear water over my monster. I want my monster to be completely covered. However, if your monster is quite large and your brush is on the smaller side, you might think about working in sections if you need to. You want to work quickly to make sure your entire section stays wet because water dries and it's usually going to dry faster than you want it to. If you get down and look at your paper at eye level, you should be able to see wet shininess on the paper or even puddles. If any part of your monster looks dull or dry, quickly add more water to that section of the page. Your monster should look wet and the background dry. Now that your monster is all wet, it's time to start adding color. For the wet into wet technique, we want to make sure that we are dipping our brush in water every time before we touch paint, even though there is water on our paper and our paint cakes are already wet. I'm going to dip my brush into the water cup, then choose a color and drop it onto my paper. I'm not going to brush it out. Since the paper is wet, the paint will spread on its own. Now I'll clean my brush in the water, dip it into another color, and drop that color onto the paper beside my first color. This is where the magic happens. You should start to see colors spread out and interact with one another. Don't brush those colors together. Let them intermingle on their own. We want to keep adding paint until our monster is bright and colorful. Remember to work quickly so your monster doesn't dry out. If the paper starts to dry, the wet into wet technique won't work anymore. Colors don't spread on dry paper, so if you notice that your colors aren't spreading anymore when you drop them onto the page, you'll need to add more water to that area. Watercolor paint needs to be really wet in order for it to work properly. We don't want our paint to be thick and goopy. We want our paint to be thin and translucent, meaning we can see areas of the paper underneath our paint. For the wet into wet technique, our paper needs to stay wet as well. Knowing when to stop is one of the most important aspects of painting. Watercolor can be a tricky medium to work with. The wet paint will continue to puddle and spread as the paper dries. So once you put paint down in an area of your paper, you should move on to a spot that hasn't been covered yet. If you put too many colors in one area, it will probably turn a muddy brown. One of the most common mistakes that I see in beginning watercolor students is a tendency to overwork the painting. I still make this mistake, so don't feel bad if it happens to you. But when you get to a point where your monster is looking colorful and wonderful, stop. Don't keep painting. If you keep painting, it won't keep looking better. Eventually, it's going to start to look bad. There are a few special effects that you can do while your painting is still wet. You can take a paper towel and dab areas of wet paint. This will partially remove paint from the paper, leaving white paper behind. This works well for making clouds in a sky or for adding white spots to your monster. You can also use this technique to dab up unwanted puddles that might be forming as your paper curls. If you have a bottle of rubbing alcohol in your house, you can use an eyedropper or a paintbrush to drop drips of rubbing alcohol onto your wet paint. This will create a chemical reaction that causes the paint to separate away from the alcohol drops, leaving spots on the paper that creates a cellular effect. Try this technique for adding texture to your monster's skin, but make sure that you do this when the paint is still really wet. If the paint has already started to dry, you won't see any change. But once your painting is entirely dry, you could go back over certain areas with more watercolor paint. At this point, I wouldn't advise using the wet into wet technique anymore, but rather wet paint onto dry paper. You can use this method for adding finer details or to darken colors that have faded as your paper dried. You could also color over parts of your monster with marker, colored pencil, oil pastel, or crayon. In upcoming videos, we'll talk about other watercolor effects in greater detail. Until then, have fun painting your wet into wet monsters. And if you want to share them with me, you can tag me on Instagram at sketching_spot. Thank you so much for watching and for making art with me. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel, Sketching Spot. There will be more art tutorials coming very soon. Happy painting! Cheers!